Good evening. My name is Ken Howard, and as director of the North Carolina Museum of History, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the museum's American Revolution Lecture Series, sponsored by the North Carolina Society of Cincinnati, the nation's oldest military hereditary organization. The American Revolution was more than a fight against the British. It was also a violent battle among neighbors forced to choose sides, loyalist or patriot. But what causes people to forsake their country and take arms against it? What prompts their neighbors, hardly distinguishable in station or success, to defend that country against the rebels? We will learn more about that tonight from our distinguished speaker, H.W. Brands, award-winning author and history professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Brands will examine these questions and remind us that before America could win its revolution against Britain, the Patriots had to win a bitter civil war against family, neighbors, and friends. Copies of Dr. Brands' latest work, Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution, are available for purchase in the museum shop. This is the 5th year of our annual American Revolution Lecture Series, and I would like to thank the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati and its members for their generous support of the museum and its programs. The museum's mission is to preserve the history of North Carolina and educate the public on that great history. Likewise, the Society's mission is to preserve the history of the American Revolution and educate the public on that history. In addition to this lecture series, the museum and the North Carolina Society have worked together to stream history programs to schools across the state from historic sites, as well as develop History in a Box kits to help teachers educate students on North Carolina's role in the Revolution. We are very grateful for the support of the Society. To find out more about the museum, our exhibits and programs, and how you can support the museum, please visit our website at ncmuseumofhistory.org. And now it is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce George Lennon, 32nd President of the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati. George, a recently retired attorney, is a native of Lumberton and a graduate of the University of North Carolina. He has worn many leadership hats: Eagle Scout, Assistant Attorney General, Navy Reserve JAG Captain, Commanding Officer of 3 Naval Reserve Law Units, Chair of the Statewide Museum of History Associates, President of the Raleigh Chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, Chair of the Capital Area Preservation Society, Chair of Yates Mill Associates, a member of the USS North Carolina Battleship Commission, and recipient of the Order of the Longleaf Pine from both Governor James Hunt and Governor Jim Martin. Please welcome George Lennon.
Thank you, Ken. It is a privilege to be here and to welcome friends to our 2022 American Revolution Lecture. The lecture is being moderated by Michelle Carr from the education staff of the Museum of History. Michelle will be coordinating your questions at the end of the program. Thank you, Michelle, for your help tonight. I will be mercifully brief. For those who may not know the history, the Cincinnati name was taken from the example of Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, who led Rome to victory in war and then did something remarkable. He declined the opportunity to become Emperor of Rome and instead returned to civilian life. In 1783, the American Revolution military victory had been won. Following the Cincinnatus citizen-soldier example, George Washington and his officers chose to return to civilian pursuits instead of pursuing in military power. They followed the classical example of Cincinnatus and adopted the name Cincinnati for this organization. The first president was, wait for it, George Washington. That was before he was president of the United States. Signed by the founders, the original institute of the Cincinnati identified a mission to perpetuate the memory of that vast event, the American Revolution. Today, we carry out that mission through a number of educational programs like this. Our General Society headquarters, library, and museum are located at Anderson House in Washington, D.C. North Carolina is one of 13 constituent state societies, plus one in France. To learn more, you can visit our websites, ncsocietycincinnati.org or societyofthecincinnati.org or American Revolution Institute. I now recognize our member Stuart Dorsett, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good evening, and thank you for joining the 2022 edition of our American Revolution Lecture Series. We are privileged to have as our speaker tonight Dr. H.W. Brands. Dr. Brands, who was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, attended Stanford University, where I'm guessing he was one of the few students who combined a major in history with one in mathematics. After an initial stint as a traveling salesman, he began teaching in high school while earning graduate degrees in mathematics and history, concluding with a doctorate in history from the University of Texas. After teaching at Vanderbilt and Texas A&M, he returned to Austin and currently holds the Jack S. Blanton Sr. Chair in History at the University of Texas. An indication of the esteem in which he is held in the state of Texas is the fact that he is a member of the Philosophical Society of Texas, whose membership is by invitation only and is limited to 250 Texans. Dr. Brands is a prolific author, having written 30 books, co-authored or edited another 5, and published numerous articles and reviews. 2 of his books, The First American and Traitor to His Class, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. His latest work, and the subject of tonight's lecture, is Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution, where he examines the American Revolution as a civil war between colonial patriots and those loyal to the British Crown and Parliament. Please join me in welcoming Dr. H.W. Brands to the Society's American Revolution Lecture Series.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here giving the American History Lecture, American Revolution Lecture this year. Thank you to the North Carolina Museum of History and the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be addressing the group. I was looking at the chat entries to see where people were from, and I was just tickled that there's somebody tuning in all the way from Singapore. I've never been to Singapore, but I have been to Corvallis, Oregon, which advertised itself as the westernmost city in the lower 48 states. I spent a lot of time in Corvallis when I was young. In fact, my father was an alum of Oregon State University. And so every other weekend during the fall, we would go down and watch the Oregon State Beavers play football. So here's to Corvallis. I saw somebody from Bend and various other places. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm quite honored when people sign up to listen to me speak when they don't have to. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin. I teach a very large class every semester. I have a class of nearly 500, mostly freshmen and sophomores. And I flatter myself to some degree to think that I'm a reasonably interesting lecturer, but I know perfectly well that if the student didn't have to be there, they wouldn't all come. They have to come because they have to figure out what's in the class and all that other stuff. But none of you had to come tonight. So the fact that you did, that you chose to take some time out of your evening, or I guess it probably is morning in Singapore, I'm most flattered that you did. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about this book that I wrote on the American Revolutionary War. And it stems from, my consideration of the American Revolution over the many years that I have been teaching and writing about history. And the longer I teach history, the older I get, the more I have concluded that the basic questions of history are really fundamental questions about human nature. They're not so much questions. The interesting questions are not questions of historical fact, who did what when, but it's sort of what did it mean to the people who were there. And over this time, I have come to sort of zero in on these questions as they relate to various eras of history. A book that I wrote before this book was about the Civil War. Well, since I've written this book that I call Our First Civil War, and it's about the American Revolution, I've taken to calling that the Civil War of the 1860s, the other Civil War. But the question that I posed in that book was, what does the honest person, the honest citizen do when he or she has concluded that his country is engaged in a very wrong-headed, even an evil course of action or policy? This is the question that I pose because it's a question that many people in the United States dealt with in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And the great evil that they were focused on was the evil of slavery. And I posed the question to two individuals, John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. And the reason I put it that way is because I wanted to see different reactions. I wanted to see an answer to this fundamental question that everybody in a democracy has to deal with sooner or later. What do you do when you think things are going wrong? And for my test, it was almost as though I was doing a scientific experiment, because I started with the premise that I have two individuals, John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, who agree that American society, American law has gone wrong on the issue of slavery, that slavery is wrong. Now, that was a different opinion. That was sort of farther than a lot of people would have gone at the time of the American Revolution. But the question for Brown and Lincoln was not so much, is slavery wrong? They agreed that it was wrong, but the question is, what do you do about it? So I've been trying to get at this question of what does the engaged citizen, what does the person, and I presuppose sort of good conscience, sincerity, because I have to admit that some of this comes out of my teaching. And I teach history to freshmen and sophomores, and they all have to take, well, they don't have to take my history class, a lot of them do, but they have to take a course in American history. And the reason for this is that the legislature of the state of Texas, like the legislation in very many other states, mandates that students, undergraduates at public universities take a certain amount of US history, because it stands in lieu of the old civics class. How does this government work? Because we are turning, as I point out to my students all the time, most of the students in my class are 18 years old, which means they are brand new citizens. They get to vote for the first time. And I point out to them, it's as though we are handing them the car. We're giving them the keys to the car. And they're going to be driving this car. They're going to be driving the United States of America. So I could use a different metaphor and call it the ship of state. And so it really behooves us to try to make sure that they sort of know, if not necessarily what they're doing, but the questions that they're going to encounter, the hazards of the road ahead. Anyway, so I have all these students, but most of them are there because it's required, not because they all declared history majors, and they're not. And so I have to put these questions to them in a way that will engage them. And because they're going to become citizens, I pose the questions that citizens will have to deal with. Now, I started writing this book about the American Revolution. Well, I started devoting myself almost wholeheartedly to this book about 2 or 3 years ago. But having said that, I have to say that I began preparing to write it, even though I didn't know I was going to write the book, many years ago. I make a point of teaching undergraduates, both because I think that undergraduates deserve the best teachers we have at universities, and I don't want to leave them simply with teaching assistants, but because I think it's very good discipline for me to have to regularly engage with these basic questions of American history. It's tempting, it's sometimes easy for people who specialize to get in their narrow field, whatever the field might be. It might be exclusive to the American Revolution, or it might be post-World War II foreign policy or something like that. But I think it's really important for the teacher of history, and I consider myself, even though I write history, to be foremost a teacher of history, to ask these big questions, because these are the ones that students have to deal with. So I said earlier, my book about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, the question was, what does the good person do when his or her country is engaged in some evil, something wrong? The question that I pose for the Revolutionary War generation is in some ways a more profound question, because it takes that basic question, what do you do when you think something's going wrong, and it poses it in a more pointed way. And what it came down to was this. I asked the question, what causes a man, and I have to add that there are some women in my story too, but you'll understand why I say women. What causes a man to forsake his country and take arms against it? This is what happened in the events leading up to and beginning the American Revolution. So there was this large group of people, British subjects living in Britain's North American colonies, who forsook their government. They said, we no longer have anything to do with the King of England or with the Parliament of England. We no longer owe allegiance to that government. We proclaim a country of our own. And we are going to fight for our independence. Now, I guess it goes without saying, but maybe bears repeating, that in the eyes of the British, they weren't an independent country at all. They were simply a bunch of rebels. And this rebellion needed to be put down by force. So it was a big step. It is arguably the biggest step, the greatest leap that citizens have to be careful, because before they were a republic, you don't call them citizens, but residents of any country. It's the biggest step residents of any country can make, to commit treason, commit treason against the government that you live under. And so this is the question I ask: what caused these people to do it? Now, to get you to come along with me on this expedition of the mind, to sort of probe the minds of people who live in the past, I'm going to ask you to do something that's not going to come naturally to you at all, especially because you are sufficiently interested in history to be watching a history lecture. So I assume that you have a greater interest in history and sensitivity to history than sort of ordinary people on the street. But I'm going to ask you to do something that probably comes unnaturally to you. I'm going to ask you to forget everything that you know about history. Everything that you know about history after, let's say, 1763. Now, the reason I'm asking you to do this is because I want to put you, I try to put my students in the shoes of the people who were making this great decision that I just said, this decision to forsake their country and take arms against it. I want to put you in the shoes of those individuals and to see what their world looked like. Now here, I'm going to digress a little bit to say that there are at least two things that historians can try to accomplish when they write works of history. And they're not mutually exclusive, but you'll understand that there's a certain tension between the two. So one thing, and I would say this characterizes most works of history, they try to explain why the things that happened in the past happened and didn't turn out some other way. And this is a perfectly admirable part of what historians do. It's part of the job description. We try to explain the past. But the other thing that historians do, and I would say that not all historians think that this is especially important. I do, however, and I think I really put this first and foremost, and that is to try to convey what it was like to be alive then, to imagine what it was like to be George Washington or to be John Adams, not to stand as the historian off at a distance hundreds of years later and knowing what George Washington did and how it was going to turn out and explain that. That, of course, as I say, is a very worthy endeavor. But to me, the interesting thing, at least at first, is to show, to the extent that I can, what George Washington's world looked like, to see the world through his eyes. And because I want to know how Washington made the decision that he made. And here, this again is where I'm going to remind you, you have to abandon hindsight for at least the next hour. Because if you know how it turned out, you do, of course, so you got to pretend you don't know how it turned out. But if you don't know how it turned out, then you'll appreciate what a leap it actually was for Washington and Franklin and Jefferson and Adams and all those other people who became rebels. They called themselves patriots, but in the eyes of the British, they were rebels. To take that step, it was a huge step. And if it had turned out differently, their lives might have taken a very different turn. Lives might have turned out to be rather shorter. And they made this decision not knowing how it was going to end. Again, I cannot stress enough, because we live in the United States of America in the year 2022, and we know that the independence movement succeeded and the colonies, the new states, won their independence, and they created this country, became the largest, the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world. And it's very tempting to think that big things like that don't happen by accident. There must have been something inevitable in that. And I would stress to you, there was nothing inevitable about it at all. If certain things, and not huge things, had happened a little bit differently on a few occasions, the outcome could have been very different. I'll come back to this as I get into some other themes and particular events of all this. So we're going to go back to the past, and I want you to imagine that you don't know how it's going to turn out. And here's the thing. When you do know how it's going to turn out, there's a thing that almost doesn't need explaining because it seems inevitable. And so I talk about patriots and loyalists. And it's tempting to think that, well, of course, George Washington was going to be a patriot, and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and various other people are going to be patriots, because that was the obvious thing to do. And so it's almost as though you can feel the pull of inevitability of history saying, okay, Washington's going to be a patriot. He's going to be a rebel. And it's tempting to think that, well, the thing that needs to be explained is why some people did not join the patriot movement, did not join the independence movement. Why did William Franklin not join his father in rebellion? Why did Thomas Hutchinson not join fellow Massachusetts man John Adams in rebelling? Why did these people make this decision that set them apart? And I would say that's utterly backwards. And I'm going to ask you to turn that view on its head, because the loyalists were the ones who just kept going straight ahead. The loyalists' decision doesn't have to be explained in the same way that the decision of the patriots has to be explained, because the loyalists didn't make any big decision to change. They just kept doing what they were doing. The ground changed underneath them, but William Franklin got up every day as governor of New Jersey and said, okay, I'm going to do what I've been doing before. And he kept doing it, kept doing it, kept doing it. Now, in the middle of this, in the middle of my book, all of a sudden he finds himself arrested as a traitor, and sort of slapped himself in the head and said, what in the world is going on? I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything treasonous. They changed the rules of the game on me. Treason is about the most heinous crime any citizen or subject can commit. This is why in countries that allow this sort of things, the punishment for treason were the most gruesome kind of punishment you can imagine. You're drawn and quartered and have boiling lead poured down your throat, and then you're hanged until you're almost dead and all this other stuff. So it's really supposed to indicate, don't do this. And ordinarily, these big things that you suffer such penalties for are crimes of what we call commission. You did something. You didn't neglect to do something, you did something. But in the case of William Franklin and Joseph Galloway and Joseph Brandon and various other people like this, in the case of the loyalists, they didn't do anything. Their sin, their crime was a sin of omission, which makes it really weird. So we have to explain. Well, I'll start with, why did George Washington become a revolutionary? Again, for the purposes of this hour, I want that to seem weird, that to seem surprising. Why do I say that? Because I'll draw you a political spectrum. And on the political spectrum, there are conservatives who want to leave things the way they are. And then to the left of the conservatives are reformers. We'll call them reformers, and you can call them liberals or progressives, whatever you call them. And then further left are radicals. The reformers want to change a little. The radicals want to change a lot. But then, as you got almost off the end of the spectrum entirely, you get the revolutionaries. They want to just blow up the system entirely and start anew. So how did George Washington wind up in that position? The people who want to change the status quo are people, usually, who are unhappy with the status quo. The status quo is not working for them. But look at George Washington. In the 1760s, the status quo was working really well for Washington. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. He was one of the most distinguished individuals in Virginia. He had a fine plantation. He had pretty much almost anything that somebody could ask for. And so anybody who's going to make George Washington be a patriot's got some explaining to do. George Washington had some explaining to do, because again, if the status quo is always beating you down, if the status quo is saying you can't do that, if the status quo is preventing you from rising, preventing you from putting food on the table, something like that, one can understand why you might say, let's get rid of the status quo and start over again. Why did George Washington do that? George Washington was a very unlikely revolutionary. And so somebody dealing with this question has to explain what's going on with George Washington. Hold that thought. Another individual whose actions have to be explained, maybe even more than Washington, is Benjamin Franklin. Because Benjamin Franklin was the great success story of the American colonies. The American colonies within the British Empire. I pose a question to you. If there never had been an American Revolution, which of the founding fathers do we know, you would have heard of? Which of the founding fathers would have come to the attention of generations in the future? Would it have been Washington? I'm not so sure. Absent an American Revolution, there wouldn't have been a commanding army, a Continental Army, and George Washington first came to fame as commander of the Continental Army. So no revolution, no Continental Army. He was the first president of the United States. No revolution, no United States of America, at least not in Washington's lifetime. So if there hadn't been an American Revolution, we might never have heard of George Washington. He might have been, people who had particular interest in Virginia might have heard of him, but the world would never have heard of George Washington. Thomas Jefferson, how about Thomas Jefferson? He became world famous. Thomas Jefferson wrote the most powerful, the most consequential sentence ever written, certainly by an American, arguably the most consequential sentence ever written by anybody in history, when he wrote, "All men are created equal." This became a standard that America has been trying to live up to ever since, but it also became a touchstone for the whole concept of human rights. When Jefferson wrote those words, the idea of human rights, there were a few Enlightenment philosophers who sort of thought in those terms that nobody else did, but now it's something that sort of the world signs on to. Now, it's honored as much in the breach as in the observance, but still it became the standard. Would the world have ever heard of Thomas Jefferson absent an American Revolution? I'd say quite likely not. He did write one book, sort of, his Notes on the State of Virginia, but for the rest of the time, he just sort of piddled around Monticello and continually remodeling the place. If there's no American independence, there's no Declaration of Independence, and we never would have heard of Thomas Jefferson. The one founding father that we would have heard of was Benjamin Franklin. How can I say this with such confidence? Because Benjamin Franklin was world famous before the revolution took place. Benjamin Franklin was born into a family of very modest means in Boston in the first decade of the 18th century. He grew up a Boston kid with very limited formal education, 2 years total in school. For the rest, he had to educate himself. I would say just parenthetically that I think this was one of the secrets of his success. The people who educate themselves, they never know what it is that they're supposed to learn and what they're not supposed to learn. As somebody who's been a teacher my whole adult life nearly, I know that one of the things we imply to our students, even if we don't say directly, is that stuff you don't have to know. It's not on the test, so it's not going to be important. Franklin never knew what he didn't have to know, so he thought he had to know everything. And so he became probably the best informed person of his generation and one of any generation. But at the age of 17, he got tired of Boston. Boston had grown too small and confined for him. He needed to find new space. He ran away from home, breaking the law, breaking the indenture that bound him to his elder brother, James, breaking his father's command that you stick with this and you do what your older brother tells you. He ran away from home and wound up in Philadelphia. Now, this was actually a stroke of real luck. And it was just a stroke of fortune because he first, if you're going down the coast from Boston, the first next big city that you're going to hit is New York. That's the first one he hit anyway. And he was looking for a job as a printer. But New York didn't need any printers at that particular moment. If Franklin had found a printing job in New York, he would have settled in New York. And he quite likely would have made his adult life and his business career there. But interestingly enough, the mindset of New York then was very business oriented and sort of just much narrower than in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the most open-minded, tolerant city within the British Empire. One of the most tolerant, open-minded cities in the world. It was the refuge for Quakers and all the dissenters. And so Franklin fit in very well there. And he really blossomed in Philadelphia in a way I'm pretty sure he never could have had he stayed in Philadelphia in a way if he had stayed in Boston. And he spent the next 30 years of his life in Philadelphia. But then eventually Philadelphia grows too small. And it's sort of happenstance that the Pennsylvania Assembly sends him to London to represent their interests against the interests of the proprietors of Pennsylvania and implicitly the governor of Pennsylvania to Parliament. And when Franklin gets to London, he thought he had died and gone to heaven. This was the greatest place ever because Franklin had interests that just grew and grew the older he got. Now, this is a striking thing, a very admirable thing about Franklin, that I think, and I'll speak for myself here too, I think that as we get older, our interests, our horizons tend to narrow. If you're going to choose a career, you don't do that, you don't do that, you do this. And so you tend to get in this direction. And I think it's fairly common that for very many people, we have figured out our answers to some of the basic questions of life sometime in early adulthood. But Franklin had an open mind on all of this until he died. He became, in his adulthood, when he was living in Philadelphia, he owned a couple of slaves. But before he died, he became the president of America's first abolitionist society. So Franklin was one who was looking for room to grow, and he loved London. Indeed, he loved London so much that he probably would have relocated permanently to London if his wife would have agreed to come. But Debbie Franklin was a Philadelphia girl. She said she was afraid to sail, but really she didn't want to move away from Philadelphia to London. She knew she would be out of her depth in London, so she stayed behind. And so Franklin always had this connection there. But this is one of those points that I alluded to earlier when I said that if things had been a little bit different, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin are generally considered to be the two indispensable figures in the success of the American Revolution. Washington on the military front, Franklin on the political and diplomatic front. But if Debbie Franklin had agreed to move to London, this was in the 1750s. This was long before the troubles brewed between the colonies and the home country. If Franklin had been a resident of London, quite possibly his sympathies, his loyalties would have lain with the government in London. He would have engaged in British politics, and he might have been in the party in Britain that opposed the war in America, but still he would have considered himself an Englishman. And this is key. This is key to all of this stuff. Every one of these people was, well, with the exception of sort of late arrivals, I'll leave them there. So essentially, everybody in this generation was born an Englishman or an Englishwoman. They were born Britons. But at a crucial moment in the 1770s, a bunch of them declared, I'm no longer an Englishman. I'm no longer a Briton. I am an American. Those become the patriots. There are others who say, I'm still a Briton. Those are the loyalists. And so what prompts Franklin to say, I'm no longer an Englishman, I'm an American? Well, I could go into this a little bit more, but instead, of course, I want you to read the book. It's all in there. But I want to convey my idea of the way that history works. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. So I conceive of history as operating at two levels. There are two arcs of history. And one arc of history is what I call big history. So there's this big history, this arc of history that I think of as going on sort of above all our heads. And what is big history? Big history is the history of laws and of governments and of war and peace and big developments in science or in world affairs. It's the history of the Industrial Revolution. It's the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the history of the amendment that gives women the right to vote. It's the big stuff you read about in history books. This is the warp and woof of history books. That's big history. And big history, what makes it big history is that it effectively touches everybody of the generation that the things take place in. So the essential point of my book is that the American Revolution, which was an aspect of big history, touched everybody in the American colonies. Everybody had to make a decision. Which side are you going to take? That's big history. Then going alongside, or sometimes I think of sort of underneath big history, is what I call little history. This is the history of individual life. This is the history of what happened to this individual on this particular day. My father was a great fan of history, and he somehow or other acquired, I think he must have purchased, maybe from a traveling book salesman, but he purchased the multi-volume biography of George Washington by Douglas Southwell Freeman. And he had it on the shelf of his office. I remember looking at it as a little kid. I think, man, that much on one person? I eventually I eventually took the books down one by one and read them. I guess this was a sign I was going to become a historian or something. But I remember my father's commentary on those books. He said, wonderful stuff. He said, I could tell you what George Washington had for breakfast every day of his life, because it's in there. Well, this is what I think of when I think of Little History. It's what did you have for breakfast? And were you grumpy that day? Did you sleep well? Did you have an argument with your wife? Did you kick the dog? You know, so it's the history that we live every day. And I will add that every one of us has our own little history. We all share the big history of our times, but each one of us has a little history. And so what happens when you add big history and little history? Well, what I would say is, well, some people like Thomas Carlyle, the English author and biographer, said that history is nothing more than the sum of biographies, and Ralph Waldo Emerson said something roughly equivalent. And I think it's a little bit more than that. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but I will say this, that if you want to understand how individuals fit in history, you have to look at both the big history and the little history. And coming back to Benjamin Franklin, I posed the question, why did Benjamin Franklin become a patriot? And I would say that it was a combination of big history and little history. I'll say the same thing for George Washington. In fact, I'll say the same thing for everybody who makes a decision in history. And this goes for John Brown and Abraham Lincoln and all the other people, which is one of the reasons. No, it's not just one of the reasons, it's the major reason that whenever I write history, I find myself writing history as a species of biography. So I have written some just plain old biographies. I wrote a biography of Benjamin Franklin. It was called The First American. Oh, getting back to something I was saying a moment ago, the reason I called it First American is that, as I said earlier, Benjamin Franklin was born an Englishman, but he died an American. And so the question for me as the biographer of Benjamin Franklin is, how did that happen? Why did I call him the first American? Because, well, now I'm going to tell you. So Franklin's little history combined with the big history. The big history landed him in London as the spokesman for the Pennsylvania Assembly, by then several other colonial assemblies. In 1774, in January of 1774, when news arrived that a mob in Boston had dumped a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor. This is the Boston Tea Party, so-called. And Benjamin Franklin was called before the British Privy Council. This is the group of the king's most intimate advisors. And he's made to answer for the sins of the colonists. He's also made to answer for what at this point, I suppose he would have considered to be a faux pas that he had made. In the interest of trying to preserve the empire, I can't stress enough that Benjamin Franklin was a success within the British Empire, and he understood that he owed his success to the British Empire. I mean, his own talents too, but it couldn't have happened anywhere else. And so Benjamin Franklin was not simply a supporter of the British Empire, he was an enthusiast of the British Empire. You're going to really have to work hard to disabuse Benjamin Franklin of his support, of his loyalty to the British Empire. Well, the British government did work really hard to disabuse Franklin of that. And the climax came in this session before the Privy Council in January of 1774, where Franklin was made to stand in the dock in this building that was charmingly called the Cockpit, not because they actually fought fighting cocks in that building, but they had done it on that site. But on this particular day, the label seemed quite apt, because Franklin was made to stand in the dock while the king's solicitor general, a man named Alexander Wedderburn, who was known for having a rapier tone and a wit and a sense of humor that would just sort of rake and stab through his opponents. And for over an hour, he just went up one side of Franklin, down the other side of Franklin, blaming Franklin for every bad thing the colonists had done, calling Franklin every name that one could think of, names that were so vile and slanderous that the newspapers would not print the names in the records, in the transcripts of what he had said. And Franklin just sits there, stands there, didn't say, he was standing there. And he never said exactly what was going through his head when this was happening, but things that he said before and after, and his actions surrounding that time, suggest that Franklin looked at Alexander Wedderburn, and he listened to Alexander Wedderburn. And Franklin said to himself, what have I done to deserve this? I'm a better man than Wedderburn. I'm a better man than these people who are members of the King's Privy Council. Franklin was a very talented individual. And although he never boasted, he understood that he was talented. And he thought, why am I being treated this way? I'm being treated this way because I am, in their eyes, a provincial. I am an American. And that's what they think of me in a negative sense. So if that's how they're going to think of me, that's what I'm going to be. I exaggerate a little, but I think not a whole lot when I say that Franklin walked into that session in the Privy Council an Englishman, and he walked out an American, which is why I called the book The First American. He's really one of the first to come to that conclusion. But that's what makes Benjamin Franklin a rebel. That's what makes Benjamin Franklin a patriot. Now, I can do something similar for George Washington and John Adams, the other people, and that's what I do in the book. I also dwell, I hope, at sort of fair length on the Loyalists. And it's a little bit different there because with Washington, Franklin, Adams, Benedict Arnold is one I look at too. He turns out to be, he plays both sides of it, as we all know. But I have to explain this decision, this change they made with William Franklin, with Joseph Galloway, with Thomas Hutchinson. I don't have to explain a turn that they made because they didn't make a turn. They just went straight. But I do try to explain why they came to different conclusions than the ones who became patriots. And if I were a historian of sort of model building mind, if I were a historian who thought of history primarily as an aspect of social science, I would try to develop a theory of American patriotism, as in referring to those patriots, or a theory of American loyalism, a predictor that would say, if you match these criteria, boom, 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 then you're going to be a patriot. And if you match these, boom, 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 then you're going to be a loyalist. I looked for those. I tried to find them, but I couldn't find them. And the reason I couldn't find them, I think, and this, I'll say that it is consonant with this view that I have of history, that to understand history, you have to look at the arc of big history, and you have to look at the arc of little history. So I've told you, I think, why I think that Benjamin Franklin became a patriot. Why did his son not become a patriot? Well, I'm not going to go through his whole story. I do in the book, but I'll just say that there was a rebellious streak in the Franklin family. I mentioned that Benjamin Franklin essentially rebelled against his father at the age of 17. And so he's making one rebellion. It was a way of establishing his identity, or I wouldn't put it quite that way. It sounds a little bit too Freudian if you do it that way. I would just say that Benjamin Franklin insisted on making up his own mind. He was not going to be thought for by his father or by anybody else. Well, William Franklin, I think, inherited that view on the world. And Benjamin Franklin came out of that session in the Privy Council believing that he had been wronged, and he realized he was going to be a patriot, although he still clung to the hope. This is ultimately vain hope that the empire could be held together. But when that turned out not to be the case, he seems to have assumed that his son would join him, that his son would somehow absorb the injury that the father had suffered and would take the same steps. But William Franklin didn't. William Franklin essentially insisted on the same prerogative that Benjamin Franklin had insisted vis-a-vis his father. I'm going to make up my own mind. And William Franklin refused to be dictated to by his father on this question of loyalty to Britain or to this new United States. William Franklin made up his own mind. In his own mind, I'm not saying that he became a patriot because he became a loyalist because his father became a loyalist. No, it wasn't a reactive rebellion, but he did insist on making up his own mind. And I have to say this about the loyalists. The loyalists by no means believed that the laws that the British Parliament had made in the dozen years before the Declaration of Independence were wise laws. Joseph Galloway is a good example here. Joseph Galloway was right beside Benjamin Franklin, in criticisms of the Stamp Act, in criticisms of the Townsend Duties, in criticisms of the Tea Act, and all this other stuff. But at the very end, Galloway and William Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson believed that as ill-guided, as ill-conceived as those laws might be, they didn't warrant breaking up the empire. They said there will be a new government, and the new government will come to its senses, and things will be made better. So they went from conservative to, they were reformers. They wanted to see things change, but they didn't go so far as the radicals and the revolutionaries. They didn't say, this system cannot be salvaged, therefore it must be destroyed. They said the system should be salvaged, it can be salvaged, so we're going to stay on board. So this is how I set this up. This is how I follow through. Now, I assume that I know that there are people who are very interested in this subject, and probably people who know more about certain aspects of this subject than I do. So I'm going to stop my presentation here. And I think Michelle is going to curate some questions. And so let's get a conversation going, even though we're miles apart.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brands, for that presentation. And I do want to let our audience know that you've been kind enough to agree to take questions tonight. If you just said, if you have a question you want to send us, we have a few that have come in already, but for those of you who haven't typed up your questions, just go into your chat function on the bottom of your screen and send me a question, and I will be happy to share as many of them as time allows with Dr. Brands. And so I'm going to start off here by looking back at some of the groups you've mentioned today. You've talked about the Patriots, you've talked about the Loyalists, but yet wasn't there a third community, or could we say population, living in the colonies at that time, sort of the independence or undecided factor?
Yeah, so this is a real, it's a very important question for historians of the American Revolution to try to get at. So what are the relative numbers of these people? And every group had an incentive to exaggerate its numbers. So the Patriots wanted the British and everybody else to think that nearly everybody in America is a patriot. And the Loyalists said, now there aren't so many patriots, there are more loyalists. The number that historians have used for the last 200 plus years is an estimate that was made by John Adams. And Adams said that at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, a third of the American population, he knew he was approximating, a third of the population were Whigs. This was the contemporary term for patriots, Whigs. And another third were Tories. This was a term for the Loyalists. And there's the other third in the middle. And I personally have not seen reason to seriously dispute that. I can't say it's especially accurate, but it sounds reasonable when you consider the influence of the different groups. And you've mentioned, Michelle, so what about the folks in the middle? Well, it served the interest of both sides, of the Patriots and the Loyalists, to force those in the middle to take sides. And in this regard, the experience of other insurgent movements, of other revolutions, is really instructive. Because when it came right down to it, the battle for American independence was a battle, and Adams acknowledged this. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of Americans. As important as George Washington and the Continental Army were to the success of the American Revolution, they occupied a very different position than British officers in the British Army did. Washington had the insight early on that he and his soldiers did not have to win the war. All they had to do was avoid losing the war. Because as long as they could keep fighting, as long as he could keep the army together, the army in existence, then the British had to keep coming after them. And from the British perspective, the war in America was a war of choice. It was not a war of necessity. The British always had the option of going home. They could eventually say, all right, enough is enough. We spent too much money. It's going to take too long to finish this job off. There could be a change of governments in London. And in fact, that's what led to the end of the Revolutionary War. The victory at Yorktown was a big deal, but it wasn't a decisive deal. The British army had not been destroyed. The British, they lost Cornwallis's army, but there were a lot of soldiers that they could have sent. If they had sent more, they could send more ships. The ships came back. The French ships had to sail away to the West Indies. And so they could have kept fighting, but they made a political decision to stop fighting. They made the same decision that the United States made in the 1970s vis-a-vis Vietnam, that the American government made just this last year and this year, last year now, regarding the war in Afghanistan. So for outsiders fighting in somebody else's country, or in this case, for the British fighting in the United States, the British can always leave. It's not an existential issue for them. If Britain loses the American Revolutionary War, Britain goes on with its existence. Okay, there are fewer colonies, but the colonies in North America weren't that big a deal to Britain. Britain went on. Britain's next century, the century after it lost the American colonies, was the greatest century in British history. In fact, it turned out to be a boon for Britain that they did lose the American colonies, because they went on and devoted their imperial efforts elsewhere. So the British always had this opportunity to say, enough is enough. So what Washington has to do, what the Patriots have to do, is persuade, first of all, their own people to stick together, but then persuade as many of those in the middle who didn't want to have to decide. And this is, I think, important to keep in mind. In most wars, most people would rather not get involved. They just want to live their lives. Most Americans did not go around picking a fight with the British government. It was all they could do to put food on the table and bring in the crops and do all that other stuff. So those Americans in the middle, who they probably had their preference, but they didn't volunteer to join the army, or maybe they weren't of military age. They realized that the Patriots, the independence guys, they might lose, and they're going to have to live with whoever comes next. But it was imperative for Washington, his side, to try to bring them aboard, if only, for example, to support his army at Valley Forge. Where's he going to get the food? And if he can find friendly neighbors in the area and they'll sell him some food, then he can keep his army together. Now, those farmers living in the vicinity of Valley Forge in Philadelphia, they realize they got to be careful here, because if they throw their support to Washington, well, what happens when Washington's army leaves and the British army comes through? Are they going to have to answer for having sympathized with the rebels? And the answer was yeah. In fact, this question comes up when I study the career, or the experience in the war of Joseph Galloway and his wife, Grace Groudon Galloway. In fact, Grace Galloway is one of the central characters of the book. And one of the reasons is she's a very interesting figure in her own, but she also, and this is necessary for the historian to be able to write about her, she kept a diary. So I can read in her words what it was like to be there. I said earlier that one of the things I really try to do is to put my readers, my students, in the place of these individuals to see what life was like for them. And Grace Galloway tells us what life was like for her. But people who lived in Philadelphia, of course, was the biggest city in America. It was a national capital to the extent that there was a national capital. And at first it was controlled by the Patriots, and Declaration of Independence was signed there and all that stuff. But then the British came along and drove Washington and his army away, and the British occupied Philadelphia. And when the British occupied Philadelphia, that's when Joseph Galloway made his appearance as the most influential loyalist, because he became a top advisor to General Howe. And it was Galloway who says, well, you ought to do this for your strategy. You ought to go south, focus on the South, because there are more loyalists in the South. And don't spend so much, don't worry about New England. They're not going to be any problem. You can cut them off. And so Joseph Galloway is riding high, and Grace Galloway, she's riding high too, as long as the British are in Philadelphia. But then the British leave, and the Patriot Army comes back, the Continental Army comes back, and the commander of the Continental Army there was Benedict Arnold. And so Grace Galloway gets to know Benedict Arnold. But having been a loyalist now in a city where it's controlled by the Patriots, she's got some answering to do. Now, Joseph Galloway was not a very gallant husband. He flees. He says, I'm out of here. I got to go to England. Otherwise, I'm going to be thrown in prison. Fair enough. Grace wasn't going to be thrown in prison. Joseph Galloway was going to be thrown in prison for being a loyalist. This happened to William Franklin. And so this middle ground was really dicey territory. So people left the middle ground only under duress. Here I'll add that some important figures in my story are people who, they're not sort of the top line, the marquee figures in the American Revolution. I had mentioned that once the war breaks out, once independence is declared, everybody has to make a decision. And this includes, well, humble men and women. The women often made a decision more or less in conjunction with their husbands. So Grace Galloway, her husband was a loyalist, so she became a loyalist. She wasn't active in politics. Women generally weren't. Abigail Adams is slightly different here. She was very interested in politics, although she was more loyal to her husband than probably to anything else. So whichever way he had gone, she probably would have gone too, although she might have chided him if he had taken the wrong decision one place or another. But even slaves who belonged to masters of patriots or loyalists. So these enslaved peoples had to make a decision. And the British pushed this issue early in the war when the governor of Virginia issued an edict offering freedom to any slave of a rebel master who is willing to flee that master and cross lines and come over to the British camp and fight against the rebels. So this was an offer of freedom. And so one of the individuals that I look at is a man named Boston King. And Boston King was a slave on a South Carolina plantation. And as the British armies moved south and they came to Charleston, he heard about this and he started thinking, well, what should I do? What's the decision I should make here? And for Boston King, as for everybody who had to make the decision, there are various factors that need to be weighed. There are things they have to consider. And one of the things is, so what are the risks? What are the risks if I don't do anything? What are the risks if I do something? What are the chances of the Patriots winning, that is the independent side winning? What are the chances of the Patriots losing? So what happens if they win? What happens if they lose? What happens to me? Am I gonna, and for slaves, this was even dicier because non-enslaved people, they could wander around and they could go wherever they wanted. But if you're an enslaved person like Boston King, merely fleeing your plantation would get you in trouble. And so, but this is where what I was saying earlier about big history and little history intersecting. So Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, had issued this edict, this offer of freedom to slaves who would cross lines and join. I have to point out, it's only slaves of patriot masters. So this is not freedom for loyalist masters. It's sort of in that regard like Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which applied only to those parts of the country in rebellion. Anyway, so Boston King, he learns about this, but he's still not immediately inclined to go because it's dangerous. He might get killed. He didn't particularly want to fight. He wanted freedom, but he didn't particularly want to fight. He had nothing especially against the independence cause. And then there's an aspect of little history that really causes him to make up his mind. And this might seem really small. Boston King, one of the reasons I can tell the story is, the main reason I can tell the story is that Boston King wrote a memoir years later. And he explained that as a boy, he was, of course, enslaved, but his life was pretty good. His father was a skilled laborer on the plantation. And so he was treated much better than the children of other slaves. And he had no particular gripes against the world. And even as he was getting older and was having to work, he probably wouldn't have taken the leap to flee the plantation and go for freedom, except that there came a point when he was wrongly charged with stealing something. And he thought, this just isn't right. And I don't have to stick around for this. So the big history made him realize, I don't have to stick around for this. But it was the little history, I've been wrongly charged, that says, that's the thing I'm not going to stick around and get charged with. So off he goes. So slaves had to make a choice. The Indian peoples, the Native Americans, had to make a choice. I focus on one Mohawk chief, Joseph Brant. The Mohawks are part of the Iroquois Confederacy. They had to make a choice. Now, one would think that they're part of that John Adams's middle third. This isn't our fight. Let's just stay out of it. But they realized, because both sides were trying to force them to take sides. And the Indian peoples, they had to make choices like this, take sides almost from the arrival of the first colonists. especially as long as Britain and France were fighting for control of North America. So Brandt's people had been siding with the British against the French. And when the British won at the end of the French and Indian 7 Years' War, then the Iroquois and the Mohawks thought, this is great, things are going to be good. But then the British have this falling out among themselves. And now Brandt and the Mohawks have to choose between one group of these British, who are calling themselves Americans, and this other group. And Brandt weighs the possibilities and thinks, on balance, probably my people are going to be better off siding with the British. But here again, there was a personal angle. The little history creeps in because Brandt, Joseph Brandt, had been taken in as a protege by the British Indian agent in that area, a man named William Johnson, who paid for Brandt's education and really was grooming him for leadership in the Mohawk Nation. And Brandt knew Johnson and he knew the British. He didn't really know anybody like that on the American side. And so he said, this is a decision that we'll make. Now, that decision that Brandt made actually split the Mohawk people because others of the Mohawks said, wait a minute, we don't want to side with the British. We're going to take our chances with this new people. So these middle folks, everybody has to decide. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody ultimately did decide. One of the big parts of my story, and this is really an untold aspect of American history, is, so what happened to the Loyalists after the Revolution? Why is it that why aren't there historical monuments to the Loyalists? Well, I mean, part of the answer, of course, is that they were on the losing side. But the other part of the answer, and this is crucial to to the answer to a question that historians have been asking forever and ever. How revolutionary was the American Revolution compared to, say, other revolutions, compared to, say, the French Revolution, which came along just the following decade, and the Russian Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, you name the revolution. How revolutionary was the American Revolution compared to those? And it's tempting to say, well, not very revolutionary, in part because those others were way bloodier. The French Revolution descended into the terror when thousands and thousands of people were getting their heads chopped off. There was nothing like that in the aftermath of the American Revolution. And in the case of the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, again, the losers, they die by the millions. There's nothing like that bloodbath in or after the American Revolution. And so it's tempting to say that, well, the American Revolution therefore must not have been all that revolutionary. But I would say that that's not exactly the right way to look at it. The reason, there's a simple reason. There's a simple reason that there was no bloody aftermath to the American Revolution. The simple reason was that the Loyalists got out. They had an exit strategy. They had a chance to leave. Now, I will say that last summer, when we saw the American evacuation of Afghanistan, it was very messy, and a lot of people, a lot of Afghans who had sided with the United States during the long Afghanistan war were desperate to get away because they feared what would happen to them if they stuck around, because their side had lost and they could be seen as traitors by the new winners. Well, I was thinking about this because this was exactly the situation that the American Loyalists faced at the end of the American Revolution. And so thousands and thousands of them had to figure out, what are we going to do? And this included people like Boston King, who had been offered his freedom, and he wound up in New York, which is the hotbed of loyalism at the end of the war. And, am I going to be sent back to slavery because the British lost? Does that mean my efforts on behalf of my own freedom have been wasted? Am I going to be punished by my former owner? How's that going to work out? Well, the fact is that the British managed to evacuate as many as 100,000 loyalists at the end of the war. They went to Canada, they went to England, they went to the West Indies, some eventually scattered. Boston King, a Black man, wound up in Sierra Leone, the colony in West Africa that the British established for freed slaves. So the reason that there was no bloodbath in America, and also the reason that the Loyalists basically fall through the cracks of history, is that they're gone. They leave. And if you think about it for a minute, nobody has any incentive really to tell their story. The winners, the Patriots, They have no interest in telling the story of the Loyalists beyond saying that they were these traitors to their country and all this stuff. And the British didn't want to particularly dwell on the experience of the Loyalists because, well, the Loyalists had loyally taken the side of Britain to defend America against these rebels, and the British had lost. And for those Loyalists like William Franklin, for example, like Joseph Galloway, who wind up, Thomas Hutchinson, who wind up in England, the British really don't want to have anything to do with them. Yes, indeed, these people did put their lives on the line. They put their careers on the line in the service of the king. But for the British generally, the American Loyalists were reminders of an ill-begotten war, a war that had gone wrong. And I liken their experience a little bit to the experience of American veterans of the Vietnam War after the Vietnam War. And the experience that many had was that after the United States lost the war in Vietnam, when they came home, there weren't any victory parades because there weren't any victory, no victory to celebrate. But in addition, people seemed to just want to forget about the war. And forgetting about the war usually meant forgetting about the Vietnam vets. And so it was only much later that there was this Vietnam Veterans Memorial and so on. So the Loyalists, they get the sort of the short end of the stick when it comes to history and remembrance. That's a long answer to one question. Boy, I better make my answer shorter.
Well, actually, you answered a few of my questions within that question.
Good,
I was going
good.
to ask.
Right.
I was going to ask
Check
about some communities that might not have identified as loyalists or as British citizens, which were enslaved people as well as native populations. Right. But I want to go back to something you said, a phrase you used. I think it was talking about the British soldiers who said, "Oh, we're not really going to worry much about the South. There's plenty of loyalists down in the South." Did you find that is sometimes an assumption I have heard, but did you find that political allegiances, did they fall along any geographic divide?
It's definitely the case that loyalism was more popular in the American South than in, say, New England. So Boston was the hotbed of patriotism. Boston was the place that really got things started, which, by the way, was a principal reason that Thomas Jefferson was asked to write the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was on the committee, Jefferson was on the committee, Franklin, and a couple others. And Adams insisted that Jefferson draft the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson said, "Why?" And Adams said, "Because you're a Virginian. I'm a Massachusetts man. Everybody knows that Massachusetts is behind this revolution, behind this rebellion. But we need to get Virginia on board, and we need Virginia's fingerprints and signature on this, and that's you." He added, "By the way, you're 10 times a better writer than I am." So it is true that the gradient of, say, patriotism to loyalism, of Whiggism to Toryism, it was most patriot in the Northeast and more loyalist as you came south, with the exception of New York City. Once the British drove George Washington away from New York City, New York City became essentially the hub, the capital of loyalist forces in America during the American Revolution, in part because New York has that unexampled seaport. And so British ships come in and out very easily, but it also controlled the Hudson Valley and access to New England and access to every other place else. But the British, relying on the predictions, relying on the estimates of Joseph Galloway, decided, that's what we ought to do. We ought to focus on the South, because this is around 1779. The war's been going on for 4 years, and they're really not making any progress. Washington has not had any real victories, but on the other hand, the British have not been able to knock him out. And so the question is, how are we going to knock him out? What the British were doing by heading south was, well, the theory was they will go south and they will organize those loyalist forces in the South, and the loyalist forces will augment British forces, and then Cornwallis and his army will move north into Virginia, and then finally force this final battle against Washington and the Continental Army. And by now, the French are starting to come on board. So they head south, and they give support to the loyalist forces there. They also trigger the bloodiest, most bitter fighting of all the war. And one of the points that I make in the book is that this was truly a civil war in the sense of being Well, father against son, as I pointed out in the case of the Franklins, and brother against brother and cousin against uncle and everybody else. Wars of one country against another country, they can be brutal, but they lack the personal bitterness that comes from fighting against people you know. Very few soldiers in Washington's Continental Army knew in any kind of personal way the regulars in the British Army that were across the lines from them. It was each was playing a role. But when you're fighting against people you know, people that live in the other town, people who live across the street, people who grew up in the same household as you, then personal grudges come in. And so some of the battles, the Battle of the Waxhaws, for example, on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, this was a ghastly battle. People were killed long after the surrender was arranged, and then there were subsequent battles to this where the Patriots sort of got theirs back. And the striking thing about it was that these were battles that were almost strictly American against American. There were some British officers commanding the Loyalists. So Banastre Tarleton was a famous, notorious British officer leading Loyalist forces. But just when you got in the trenches, when it was soldier against soldier, bullet against bayonet, it was American against American, and it was horribly bloody fighting. So that was one of the features of the fight in the South. But it also brought out that Galloway and the British overestimated the predominance of loyalism in the South, because there were sort of different feelings. Georgia was largely loyalist, not because people who live in Georgia were enthusiasts of the British Crown, but because Georgia was a frontier state at that time, a frontier state in an unusual way. Nearly all the other colonies had western frontiers, but Georgia had a western frontier and a southern frontier. And on the southern frontier were Indians and the Spanish. And so the Georgians basically said, I should say many in Georgia said, we cannot afford to antagonize the British Crown. We need the British Army to defend us. And to some degree, that view was shared. There were also greater sort of class and geographic rifts in the southern colonies between the planters of the Low Country and the Scots-Irish of the back country. And many of the Scots-Irish had no love whatsoever for the British and no love for the planters. And so the political split within the colonies sort of was laid atop the split between the colonies and the mother country. The result of this was that Cornwallis and the British were very disappointed at the success that they were able to achieve in the South. And so Cornwallis eventually changed his mind and said, I'm not going to be able to build up this large loyalist army in the South. And he moved back north, which is what finally led him to Yorktown and the end of his part in the Revolutionary War.
Thank you. There have been a lot of questions about the Southern allegiance, and I think believe here, as you said, that perhaps the assumption that the South, the Southern citizens, they weren't states quite yet as we know them, but that they were predominantly loyal has been overstated. And I think you agree with that clearly. You lay out your theory of big history, little history. This really intrigues me. But yet we tend to think it's the big history. These are these pivotal moments that things turn on. This is the ideas, in a sense, drive actions. That's a phrase I've heard. But you keep coming back to the little history. How much of this is personal? How much of these decisions were individually made by personal experiences and something that happened to the individual? And I can't help but think, what if so many things if they had been slightly different, how the history of the nation would have been dramatically and diametrically opposite of what we are, different from as we know it today.
Oh, I agree. Well, I was about to say I agree completely. I agree completely with the sentiment that you've expressed. Now, I sometimes wonder, well, suppose George Washington had not become a patriot. Suppose Benjamin Franklin had not become a patriot. Suppose, in fact, that the loyalists, that sentiment had predominated. So let's suppose there's no American Revolution. I certainly would not go from there, and I'm sure you weren't intending that either, to say that, okay, we would still be part of the British Empire. No, no. And Franklin perhaps was the first to realize there was an inevitability about some of the stuff that was happening. Franklin was America's first demographer, somebody who studied the growth of populations. And very early on, Franklin, in the data they had to work with was pretty imperfect, but nonetheless, he concluded pretty accurately that the population of the American colony was doubling about every generation. Now, that's an extremely rapid rate of growth. But what it meant was that before very long, the population of British North America would outstrip the population of English Britain. So Britain in North America would have larger population than Britain in Britain. And what Franklin was trying to do is to tell the British, this is going to happen. And if you manage this right, then the British Empire will go on and on and on. What you have to do is you have to give us room to grow. You have to allow the American branch of the family to achieve a co-equal status with the English branch of the family. You do that, and we'll be happy, you'll be happy, we'll be strong, and all will be well. So there was an inevitability about that part. The population was going to continue to grow. And eventually, America was going to get self-government. But the way that America got self-government might have been the way, for example, Canada got self-government. Basically, the British in the 1860s said, you know, the cost of governing Canada isn't worth the expense of, the cost is too great, and the benefits, let's just tell the Canadians, okay, you guys can run your own affair. You still probably ought to acknowledge the queen at that point. And then you can run your own affairs and that'll be fine. If the British had offered that to the Americans in the 1770s, or for that matter, suppose there hadn't been an American Revolution, maybe the British offer it 30 years later. That's the sort of thing that could have happened. Now, the British learned a lot from their experience with the Americans in the American Revolution, because the British never again fought against a revolution like that. The British realized there comes a time when the colonies are going to insist on their independence. And so wisdom lies in a graceful exit. And this is what the British did in Canada. This is what the British did in India. This is what the British did in West Africa. So this is the British, well, it was a learning experience for them. So now, of course, if we get in the realm of counterfactual history, well, if there hadn't been an American Revolution, would the British have ever learned that? Maybe it required harsh reality for it to set in. But anyway, but I think that if things had been a little bit different, I described sort of the moment in Benjamin Franklin's own personal little history where he intersected with the big history and became a patriot. There's no single moment. Well, maybe some of your readers will be, some of the listeners will be familiar with this, but George Washington rode with General Edward Braddock in the French and Indian War, and Washington had a chance to measure himself against British officers. He was very young at this time, he's still in his 20s, and he measured himself against the British officers, and especially at the disastrous battle at the forks of the Ohio River, where Braddock is killed. Washington and his Virginia militia, they performed much more gallantly than the British. And Washington had a chance to size himself up against his British counterparts. And he realized, I'm a better officer than they are. I know more about leading men. I'm braver than they are, and all this other stuff. And at that point, Washington realized, okay, I could be a real player. I could be a leading officer in the British Army. And if the British had just had the sense to say, what we really ought to do is we ought to take the best talent from America and bring these people into the British Army. If the British had done that, if they had promoted George Washington in the British Army, then George Washington, quite likely, would have been on the other side of any revolution. Or maybe if the British had been farsighted enough to be able to do that, they might not have provoked the colonists to the rebellion that they gave. But for Washington, that part of his little history was this sense that I'm being commanded by these idiots. I am being treated as a second-class military officer by individuals that I could ride into the ground, that I could, I could defeat in any test of military acumen. And for Washington, and part of it you could read as, okay, this is Washington's ambition. Washington wants to continue to rise. Yeah, that's true enough, but it's not like he wanted to rise and become president of an independent country. That's not why he took the side of rebellion. But it was just this sense that this isn't right. This state of affairs is not right. And with Franklin, there's this dawning sense that they're not going to let me be a full Englishman, a full Briton. Therefore, I'm going to have to be an American. And that's going to have to be the way I go. There's something very striking about Washington. When you read Washington's letters, he uses the terminology of, if we submit to these British acts of oppression, if we submit to the proclamation of 1763, which meant that Washington was not going to be able to develop the lands he bought on speculation in the Ohio Valley. This was a serious thing for Washington. He's not going to be able to develop that. When they passed the Stamp Act, Washington was opposed to the Stamp Act. He could certainly afford to pay the taxes, but he just didn't think it was right. But when Washington is writing letters to people, that he says, if we let ourselves be coerced into doing this, we will be no better than slaves. Now, these days, when you read this, you have to step back and say, wait a minute, what's Washington talking about here? Washington owned real slaves. He's using this term slave metaphorically. But I think it's important to remember that Washington he wasn't speaking metaphorically. This is what he was thinking, that the British are going to crush us all down to this level where they can tell us what to do. And Washington, like Franklin, understood that he was a talented person. He had a capacity for leadership, and he didn't like being told what to do. He didn't like being ordered around by people who were simply pig-headed, people who had no interest in paying any attention to Americans' interest. And he thought that's just the wrong way for things to be. One last point on this, and that is that some of this can be explained by the fact that for the first 150 years of their existence, the American colonies were allowed to govern themselves. The British sometimes this has been called the age of benign neglect. The British okay, you guys can go out there. By the way, the British government did not found the American colonies the way the Spanish government, the French government founded colonies in their empires. No, Englishmen and women on their own said, we're leaving and we're going to found this. And sometimes they organized in companies like the Virginia Company. But it wasn't at the expense, it wasn't at the risk of the government. The people just did it on their own. And so they got in this habit of governing themselves. And then come the 1760s, the British start saying, you know what, we're going to tighten things up. You're going to make this more like what goes on in England. And Americans they had this long tradition of governing themselves. And when the British said, no, you're not going to any longer, then, and this is crucial, I think, the American revolutionaries made their revolution in the name of English liberties, at least as they understood them and as they and their fathers and grandfathers had experienced them. So the American Revolution was made in the name of tradition, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but if you start looking at revolutions, this happens all the time.
Sorry, I always mute myself and take my camera off. That way I can read all the questions coming in and make sure I'm absorbing everything. And sometimes I don't click back quickly enough. It's close to 8:30. So I want to wrap up, even though there are lots of good questions, and I appreciate the audience's patience staying with us. And it's really a testament to their interest in this topic and the quality of your presentation. I'm going to mix things up a little bit and perhaps ask you a lighter question, not so much about history, but about yourself and your writing career. You are a very prolific author, and most of your books, I would say, are biographical in intent or approach history often as a biography or through biographical research. How do you go about choosing your topics?
How do I choose my topics? Well, one of the things that helps me in writing the stuff that I write is the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that I teach freshman US history, which means that I teach broad sweeps of history. Beginning in the fall, I start at pre-colonial times, and by spring, we've made it to the present. And so every year, I go across the whole arc of American history, that whole arc of big American history. But I'm always on the lookout for moments in American history that I think need explaining, or individuals that I think somehow can carry the story. When I wrote a series of biographies, so I've written about 6 or 7 sort of regular biographies focused on one person. That was really in the service of writing a long history of the United States, but I wanted to hang the story on individuals. This because of what I've described about my interest in where big history and little history intersect. And so there's something else that I'll concede, and that is I was really hoping to draw in readers who didn't think they were interested in history. A lot of people have recollections of their high school history class, and they think it was kind of boring. We just had to learn about old stuff and dates and names, and it just didn't make any sense. And so when I write my books, this is the same way I teach my class. I tell students stories. The students come into my class and I tell them stories. So my lectures are very much like my books in that I hang my stories, not my lectures, on individuals. So I tell the story of these individuals and I ask my students to put themselves in the position of these individuals. So how do I choose my subject? Well, sometimes there's somebody interesting that I wanted to write about. I always wanted to write about George Washington. I think that anybody who wants to really understand very much of how the country was founded, but not just founded, because George Washington remains this towering figure in American history down to the present day. You need to come to grips with George Washington. You need to understand this guy. And sometimes it's easy, I think, to think of, well, Washington is this guy, is just up on the pedestal. He's sometimes called the Marble Man and things like that. Of course, that's sometimes been applied to Robert E. Lee as well. There are some similarities between the two. But the fact is that Washington, it was not inevitable that Washington will wind up as the father of his country. And this is sort of the thrust of why I try to take my readers, I go there first, but then take my readers along with me on, so what was it like when George Washington was growing up? Well, what about when he made his first trip to Ohio, his first time in the backcountry? When did he discover that he was good at soldiering? When did he discover that people would follow him? So I'm intrigued by these individuals. And some of the individuals I'm intrigued by are individuals that people have been intrigued by for a long time. I had to write about Benjamin Franklin because Benjamin Franklin is any history writer's, any biographer's dream. Because especially for somebody like me, who gives my figures, my subjects, the opportunity to speak whenever possible, because I want to see, and I want my readers to see what the world looked like to them. So I let them speak. Well, nobody's been a more charming, artful writer than Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin was always saying something that was very quotable. So I choose them on that basis. Sometimes I choose somebody like John Brown because I want to use him as the counterpart to Abraham Lincoln. I was certainly going to write about Abraham Lincoln, but since there have already been 1,000 biographies of Abraham Lincoln, I didn't think the world needed another biography of Abraham Lincoln, but I wanted to pair him with somebody, John Brown, so I could answer this question. Increasingly, let's say of late, in the last 6 or 8 years, I've been looking at these questions, the questions that I explained early on, the questions that are not only important in history, but that have continuing relevance. And so one of the questions that I put to my students, and I certainly don't intend that they conclude from this that the country is on the edge of a revolution or a civil war or anything like that. I dearly hope that we're not. But nonetheless, so I ask my students, I ask audiences, I'll ask this group, so what would it take for you to conclude that things were going so wrong in this country that I'm going to withdraw allegiance from the country, from the government, and I'm going to join people who are going to start a new government? And it sounds like a stretch. It should sound like a stretch. Is it more? Would it be more of a stretch for Americans in 2022 or in 2030 or whenever it might happen than it was in the 1770s? I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure. But I'm trying to, once again, get across what it was like to be alive then, the stakes that people face. These are enormous stakes. And the last thing, I'll go back to the first thing that I said, that in order to understand these people, why they made the decisions they made, why they acted as they did, we have to act as though we don't know how things turned out. Because let's just suppose things get very much worse in the United States. And there are people who say, you know, we need to secede from the Union or something like that. They'll make that decision not knowing how it turns out. And the rest of us will have to figure out how to respond to that, not knowing how it's going to turn out. So if we can go back to the past and for a moment put on the blinkers so we don't know how it turned out and see what it was like to be those people in my classes. I ask students all the time, I'll ask the viewers this evening, to imagine what it was like to be Washington, to be Franklin. What would you have done? And I understand that it's not the same as if you're really doing it, but it's the closest thing we can get. And so for me, to the extent possible, I try to make history experiential. What would you do? What did it feel like to be there? That's what I try to do.
Well, thank you. And once again, you sort of set up my next question, which I'm going to close with tonight. As a history major and a museum educator, I fully understand what you mean about this perception in many people's eyes that history is this dull, sort of stagnant field. And I disagree completely, as I know you do. But we like to say here that history is narrative. We tell stories at the North Carolina Museum of History. We give voice often to those people who are voiceless and sometimes faceless even in the past. We try to tell all those stories in North Carolina. We also say you can learn from the past. And so I feel I really need to ask you, in your opinion, what do you think, having written this book, studied this major event in American history, what are the lessons that those of us living here in 2022 can take from your book and those who lived through the American Revolution?
There are two lessons that I think are crucial from history. The first lesson is that history, like life, is more complicated than you think. Many people go back to the past hoping that they can get a simple, pat answer to something. And so what was the meaning of the American Revolution? What was the meaning of the Civil War? What was the meaning of this, that, and the other thing? And they can come away with a bumper sticker answer and apply it to the present. Well, the past was just as complicated as the present is. And so the first lesson of history is that it is more complicated than you think. Now, I happen to like complication. And for me, the more complicated things are, the more interesting they are. But there are some people who get impatient with that. And so I think they need to be aware, if they're going to really do justice to history, they need to be prepared for complications. And that's at the heart of this book. So the American Revolution was not good guy Americans against bad guy British. There were Americans who were split and they couldn't decide. They each thought that they were right. And so that's one of the complications. The second thing, and this is sort of more of a takeaway from history, the one thing that I think history ought to teach is humility, because there's a temptation for each generation to think we finally got it right. We finally know what the relations between individuals ought to be, or the way people ought to conduct themselves, or something like this. And it's very tempting for each generation to take this sort of patronizing view of the past. They did things differently in the past, and oh God, they didn't know any better and all that stuff. But every generation does something that future generations are going to just shake their heads at. And you can run down the list of what Washington's generation was doing, what Lincoln's generation was doing, what the generation of the 1930s was doing. And I would say that given the fact that those people were doing the best they could under those circumstances, things still often turned out badly. We certainly are doing things that our grandchildren are going to just roll their eyes and shake their heads at. We do the best we can. And so when we look at history, I tell people, be humble, be modest, don't stand in judgment on the past. They are as upstanding for the most part as you are. They're doing the best they can. Take that lesson of humility and look at yourselves, at ourselves. Don't think that any group of us, have all the answers. None of us are entirely right. So if people can take from history the lesson of humility, I think it will make us all better citizens. It will make us all able to live with each other. We have to acknowledge that people have different points of view than we do, and that we just have to be modest about our goals. If we can make a little bit of progress, if we can make things a little bit better, if we can leave our world a little bit better than we started, we're not going to make it perfect. We're not going to have all the answers, but just push the wheel a little bit down the road. That's what we can hope for. And if history helps us do that, then good for history, good for us.
Thank you, Dr. Brands, for joining us tonight and giving us this fascinating look at the American Revolution through the eyes of individuals, so that we can truly think about this as a personal experience and see how it played out in our lives today. I think it's a fascinating look at this moment in history. It's a very personal look, which I enjoyed. I do encourage all of you, if you have not read Dr. Brand's book, don't feel badly because it's so new. It's not even 4 months old. It just came out in November of last year. So this is your chance to read it. Please rush to your library, rush to your bookstore. You can also go to the North Carolina Museum of History shop at ncmuseumofhistoryshop.org and purchase a signed copy. Dr. Brand has signed book plates, and we will place them in any copies you buy from the museum store. So I just wanted to let you know about that opportunity. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank Dr. Brands for joining us from Texas. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank the North Carolina Society of the Cincinnati, which presented this lecture, our 5th annual American Revolution Lecture Series. I hope you won't wait till next year to join us again. There are many more programs coming up at the North Carolina Museum of History, but I want to thank you all for joining us and have a pleasant night and a wonderful weekend. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.